Black man got fed up with racist Karen using his pool, so he did this. Marcus had always been a quiet man. Living in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, he found comfort in the simple things, like tending to his beautiful backyard or sitting by his sparkling pool on warm afternoons, enjoying the peace and quiet. After long days of hard work, he treasured these moments of solitude. He had worked hard to create a serene home, a place where he could relax and unwind without the noise or stress of the world outside. His backyard, a lovely space filled with vibrant flowers, a well-manicured lawn, and his pride and joy. The pool was where he found his escape. The cool blue water was a perfect contrast to the golden sun, and the sound of the water as it rippled from the fountain was like music to his ears. Marcus often spent hours by the pool, reading a book, sipping on a cold drink, or just letting his mind wander. He had lived in this house for a few years now, and although he didn't interact much with his neighbors, he knew who they were. There was the young couple with the small children 2 houses down, the retired woman who lived next door and loved to garden, and then there was Karen. She was a woman in her late 30s, with bleach blonde hair and an air of entitlement that was impossible to ignore. At first, Marcus didn't think much of her. She was a neighbor, after all, and he wasn't the type to get involved in everyone's business. But over time, he began to notice Karen spending more and more time in his backyard. She would often appear, dressed in a swimsuit, lounging by his pool without so much as a word to him. At first, Marcus thought it was a mistake. Maybe she didn't realize he was home. But when it happened again and again, he started to wonder what was going on. The first time Karen came over, Marcus had been in his living room, watching a movie when he saw her walk through his backyard gate and settle down by the pool. She spread out a towel, stretched out in the sun, and acted as though it was completely normal. She didn't knock, didn't say hello, and definitely didn't ask for permission. Marcus had been shocked. He never experienced anything like it. But instead of confronting her, he stayed quiet. Maybe she was just confused, he thought. Maybe it was just a one-time thing. But it was. Karen continued to come over, sometimes multiple times a week. She would bring her own towel, sunglasses, and sometimes even a book. She would stay for hours, lounging in the sun without acknowledging Marcus at all. It was as if she had no sense of boundaries or respect for Marcus's privacy. At first, Marcus told himself it was no big deal. After all, the pool was in his backyard, but it wasn't as if she was doing anything harmful, right? But as the weeks went by, Marcus began to feel uncomfortable. His backyard had always been his sanctuary. The pool was a place where he could clear his mind, relax after a long day, and enjoy the solitude he so desperately needed. But now, with Karen there so often, he felt like that peace was being taken away from him. It wasn't just that she was in his space. It was the feeling of being ignored, of having his personal property used without any regard for him. Marcus tried to ignore it, but the feeling of frustration only grew. He started noticing more things. Like how Karen would sometimes leave her trash behind, empty bottles or wrappers scattered around his pool area. She never bothered to clean up after herself. And when he did see her, she would barely acknowledge his presence, as if he were invisible. Her attitude seemed cold and dismissive. Marcus had been raised to be polite, to respect others, but Karen's behavior was starting to make him question whether politeness was even enough in this situation. It wasn't long before things started to feel even more uncomfortable. One afternoon, Marcus decided to go out and sit by the pool to enjoy the rare calm day. As he walked outside, he saw Karen already there. She had set up her towel and was laying in the sun, completely relaxed. Marcus paused, unsure of what to do. Should he say something? Ask her to leave? It felt awkward, but this time he couldn't ignore it. "Hey, Karen," he called out, his voice steady but cautious. She turned her head, looking over her sunglasses with a lazy smile. "Oh, hey, Marcus," she said, barely lifting her head. "I hope you don't mind. It's just so nice out, and I thought I'd catch some sun." Marcus stood there for a moment, feeling unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to start a confrontation, but he also didn't want to feel like his space was constantly being invaded. "It's just," he started, hesitating, "I wasn't really expecting anyone today. Maybe next time you could ask first?" Karen didn't seem to take him seriously. She simply shrugged, then said, "Oh, come on, Marcus. You have a pool. It's not like you're using it all the time." "I thought it was fine." Her words stung, even if she didn't mean them to. To her, it was just a pool, a nice feature that came with the house. But for Marcus, it was more than that. It was his escape, his quiet place where he could find some peace. And now it seemed like that was being taken away from him, piece by piece. Still, Marcus didn't say anything else. He just nodded and went back inside, but the discomfort lingered. Every time he saw her by the pool, it gnawed at him, like a constant reminder that his boundaries were being ignored. The worst part was that she didn't even seem to notice or care. To her, it was just an inconvenience that Marcus might ask her to leave, but it wasn't a big deal. Marcus had always been the type to keep to himself, to avoid conflict. But as the days passed, the situation started to weigh on him. His peaceful retreat had turned into a source of frustration, and he knew he couldn't continue to let Karen use his pool without addressing it. But how could he do that without making things awkward? How could he stand up for himself without causing a scene? And so, Marcus found himself in a dilemma. He didn't want to make things uncomfortable, but he also knew that he couldn't keep allowing this to happen. Something had to change, and he knew it had to start with him. As he sat in his living room later that day, looking out the window at Karen lounging by the pool again, he made a decision. He wasn't going to just let things go on like this. He deserved to enjoy his space, and it was time to make that clear. As the days passed, the situation only grew more frustrating for Marcus. He had always prided himself on being a patient person, someone who could endure discomfort without letting it bother him too much. But with Karen's continued presence by his pool, he found himself losing that patience. The peace he once enjoyed in his own backyard was now constantly disrupted. It wasn't just the fact that Karen was there. It was the way she treated the space, the way she acted as if it was hers and not his. Every time he stepped outside, there she was, lounge chair, sunblock, and sunglasses, as if she were a guest of honor. But Marcus didn't feel like a host. He felt like a spectator in his own life, watching as someone else took ownership of his space. It wasn't even just the pool anymore. Karen had started to leave things behind. A towel, a bottle, an empty snack bag without any concern for tidiness. The small, careless acts began to add up, and Marcus found himself more and more irritated each time. One afternoon, Marcus decided to take action. He had been stewing over the situation long enough, and his frustration was reaching a boiling point. The last straw came when he saw Karen, once again, relaxing by the pool, acting as if she had every right to be there. This time, however, she was even more brazen. She had brought her dog with her, letting it run around his backyard, digging up the flower beds. The dog barked incessantly, its sharp yelps echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Marcus's blood began to boil as he watched from his window. The final straw wasn't just the dog, though. It was when Karen stood up, stretching in the sunlight, and glanced over her shoulder at Marcus's house with an almost dismissive look. She caught his eye for a brief moment and smiled, just a smile, but it was the kind of smile that felt patronizing. It was as if she knew she had overstepped but was too proud to care. Marcus stood there for a while, frozen in place, watching her. He didn't know what to do anymore. His heart raced in frustration, and the more he stood there, the more he realized that he could no longer let this go. He had let it slide for too long, trying to keep the peace and avoid confrontation, but it wasn't working. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about respect, about boundaries, and about taking control of his own life again. That evening, Marcus sat in his living room thinking. His thoughts were jumbled, but one thing was clear: he needed to say something to Karen. The idea of confrontation filled him with dread, but he knew it was the only way to restore his peace of mind. He couldn't continue to ignore it. It wasn't just a matter of Karen using his pool. It was the way she treated him and his home, as if he didn't matter. He thought about his options. Should he go over to her house and knock on her door? Should he call her? The direct approach seemed like the most straightforward, but Marcus was someone who preferred to avoid confrontation if he could. He didn't want things to escalate, but at the same time, he didn't want to be a doormat either. His emotions were a mix of anger, confusion, and a deep sense of disappointment. He had never imagined that something as simple as his backyard could turn into a battleground. The next morning, Marcus decided that he couldn't wait any longer. It was time to take action. He stood by his window, looking out at his backyard and at Karen, who was already lounging by the pool as if nothing had changed. This time, though, Marcus didn't hesitate. He took a deep breath and walked outside. The sun was already high in the sky, casting a warm glow on everything it touched. He walked out the back door and stepped onto the cool tiles of the poolside, his footsteps quiet but determined. Karen was reclining in her chair, reading a book, completely unaware that anything was about to change. The sound of her turning the pages was the only noise in the otherwise peaceful backyard. "Karen," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. It felt strange to speak to her like this after all the times he had stayed quiet, but he knew it was time. Karen glanced up from her book, a slight smile on her face as she saw him. "Oh, hey, Marcus," she said cheerfully, as though everything was perfectly normal. "How's it going?" "I need to talk to you," Marcus replied, his voice calm but with an edge of seriousness that made her pause. She put the book down and sat up, looking at him curiously. "Sure, what's up?" she asked, though her tone was a bit more guarded now, as if she could sense that something was different about this conversation. Marcus took a deep breath before speaking. "Look, Karen," he began, trying to keep his voice even. "I've been noticing that you've been using my pool a lot lately without asking. And I don't want to sound rude, but I'm not comfortable with it anymore. It's my personal space, and I would appreciate it if you could respect that." Karen's face seemed to freeze for a moment, and Marcus could see the confusion on her face. She wasn't used to someone standing up to her, especially not in such a direct way. For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension. Marcus could feel his heart beating faster, but he didn't back down. This was something that needed to be said. "I don't mean to cause any trouble," he continued, "but this is my backyard and I value my privacy. I need you to respect my space, and that means no more using my pool without permission." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time Marcus saw her expression shift from casual indifference to something else, a mix of surprise and irritation. She opened her mouth to respond, but Marcus cut her off. "I'm not trying to start a fight," he added quickly, trying to keep things from escalating. "I just want things to be clear. You can't keep coming over here without asking. I'm sure you understand that." Karen paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. It was clear she wasn't used to being spoken to like this. For a moment, there was a long silence between them. The sounds of the neighborhood, the chirping of birds, the distant hum of cars, seemed to fade away as Marcus waited for her response. Finally, Karen let out a small sigh, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Okay," she said, her voice much quieter now. "I get it. I guess I just thought it was no big deal." Marcus nodded, relieved that she wasn't being combative. "It's a big deal to me," he said, his tone softening just a little. "I hope you can understand that." There was another awkward silence before Karen stood up, brushing off the towel from her legs. "I'll just go then," she muttered, clearly a little embarrassed. Marcus watched as she gathered her things and left, her footsteps echoing as she walked through the gate. Marcus stood there for a few moments, watching her go. A sense of relief washed over him. It had been a difficult conversation, but he felt proud of himself for standing up for what he believed in. He had set a boundary, and he wasn't going to let anyone walk all over him. As Karen disappeared from view, Marcus turned back to his pool. The water shimmered in the sunlight, and for the first time in a long time it felt like his space again. The peace he had been longing for had finally returned, and he knew that from now on, things would be different. After the conversation with Karen, Marcus felt a strange mix of relief and lingering tension. His heart was still racing a little, but the weight that had been hanging over him for weeks seemed to lift. He had done what he needed to do. He had set a boundary, and Karen had left without arguing. There had been no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just a simple conversation where he had stood up for himself. For the rest of that afternoon, Marcus tried to focus on the things he enjoyed. He picked up a book he'd been meaning to read for weeks, sat by the pool, and allowed himself to relax. The world felt a little quieter, a little more peaceful. It was like the small bubble of stress that had surrounded him had popped, and for the first time in days, he could breathe without the nagging feeling that someone was constantly invading his space. But as the evening drew closer, Marcus began to reflect on what had just happened. His thoughts drifted back to the moment when he had confronted Karen. Part of him had been surprised by how easily he had spoken up. He hadn't known if he would be able to do it. He had expected to feel awkward, to stumble over his words, but instead, his voice had been steady. He had asked for something that he needed, something that was rightfully his, and Karen had left without putting up much of a fight. Marcus couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. He had done something that wasn't easy for him. He wasn't the type of person to start conflicts. He usually avoided them at all costs. But in this case, Avoiding the issue had only caused him more frustration, and he had finally realized that it was okay to stand up for himself. The next day, Marcus was determined not to let his victory slip into complacency. He was aware that Karen might not take the conversation as smoothly as it appeared. People like her, who had grown accustomed to getting what they wanted without question, often didn't accept being challenged so easily. He could already imagine her telling others in the neighborhood her version of the story, maybe even making him out to be the unreasonable one. She had a way of making everything seem like it was someone else's fault, but Marcus was ready for whatever came next. He knew he had done the right thing. As the days passed, Marcus kept an eye on his backyard. He wasn't expecting any immediate trouble, but he stayed alert. Every time he walked past the window and saw the pool, it reminded him of the conversation with Karen. It was like a small victory, a reminder that he had reclaimed his space. He still felt a little uneasy, but it wasn't the same unease he had felt when he let Karen walk all over him. It was more of a quiet confidence, a growing belief that standing up for yourself didn't always have to lead to chaos. Sometimes it just led to peace. A week went by without any sign of Karen. Marcus was almost starting to think that maybe things had returned to normal. But then, one morning, as he was getting ready to leave for work, he saw something that made his heart drop. Karen was walking through his backyard gate again, as if nothing had happened. For a moment, Marcus froze. His first instinct was to go outside and confront her again. But this time, he felt different. He wasn't angry, not in the way he had been before. Instead, he felt a sense of disbelief. Hadn't they just talked about this? Hadn't they just had that conversation where he told her to respect his space? He watched as Karen set up her towel by the pool. She seemed unaware of him standing at the window watching her. She laid down as if she had every right to be there. A sense of frustration began to bubble inside of him, but he tried to stay calm. The last thing he wanted was to go outside and escalate things. He had spoken to her already. She knew how he felt. But still, the situation felt impossible to ignore. How could she just act as if their conversation had never happened? It was as if she had completely disregarded what he had said. The feeling of being disrespected crept back into Marcus's chest, making him feel small and helpless again. He didn't want to be angry. He didn't want to start another confrontation. But he also didn't want to let her walk all over him again. Marcus sat down at the kitchen table, his mind racing. What should he do? Should he go out there and remind her of their conversation, or should he call her out again, this time with more force? He knew that Karen had a way of twisting things, of making him look unreasonable. He didn't want to get caught in another argument that would just make him feel worse. He thought back to the first time he had spoken to her. The way he had been calm, composed, and direct. Maybe that was the key. Maybe this time he could approach the situation the same way. He didn't need to yell or get upset, he just needed to be clear. He needed to remind her that his space, his pool, was off limits unless he gave permission. And he needed to do it without letting her guilt trip him into backing down. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stood up. He didn't want to waste any more time feeling frustrated. He walked to the back door, opened it, and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the sound of the wind rustling the leaves in the trees was strangely calming. He felt the weight of the moment pressing on him, but he kept walking toward the pool. Karen was still lying on her towel, her eyes closed, completely unaware of his approach. "Karen," Marcus said, his voice clear and firm. She opened her eyes and sat up, looking surprised to see him standing there. She quickly stood, brushing off her towel. "Hey, Marcus, what's up?" she asked, her tone casual as if nothing was wrong. Marcus took a moment before speaking. He wasn't going to let his frustration take over. He wasn't going to let her get under his skin this time. "I thought we talked about this," he said, keeping his voice steady. "This is my backyard, and I've asked you not to use my pool without asking. I'd like you to leave." Karen blinked, the surprise evident on her face. For a moment, she didn't say anything. It was as if she hadn't expected him to speak up again, as if she thought the first conversation had just been a passing moment. But Marcus stood his ground, waiting for her response. "Marcus, she started, but he cut her off. "I'm not trying to be rude," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But I've asked you before and I'm asking again. Please respect my space." Karen's face flushed, and for a brief moment Marcus thought she might argue, but then something shifted. She glanced around almost nervously and let out a small sigh. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll leave." Marcus nodded, his heart still beating fast, but now with a sense of finality. She packed up her things and left, this time without any further protest. After she was gone, Marcus stood by the pool, taking a moment to breathe. The anger that had been building inside of him was gone. It had been replaced by a calm sense of accomplishment. He had done what he needed to do. He had stood up for himself, and he hadn't let Corinne's behavior slide this time. The peace he had longed for was finally his again. The days following the second confrontation with Corinne were quiet. Too quiet, Marcus thought. He had set his boundary, and for the most part, things had seemed to settle. There were no more surprise visits to his pool, no more awkward moments of discomfort. It was like the calm after a storm, with the world around him continuing on as if nothing had happened. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering in the air. He had done what needed to be done, but a part of him couldn't help but feel uncertain. Had he truly put an end to the problem, or had he just delayed the inevitable? Marcus spent the next few days trying to keep his mind occupied. Work was busy, which helped to keep his thoughts from drifting back to the situation with Corinne. He focused on the small tasks around the house, like tending to his garden and cleaning the pool. These were the kinds of things that helped him clear his mind. The sun was setting earlier these days, and the evenings were getting cooler. It was the kind of time when Marcus would normally enjoy the stillness of his backyard, the quiet of the night with only the rustling of leaves in the trees. But each time he stepped into the yard, his eyes would inevitably drift toward the spot by the pool where Corinne had been just a few days ago. It was as if the spot had been marked by her presence, and it reminded him that the issue wasn't completely resolved in his mind. Every time he went to relax by the pool, there was that nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Despite the absence of Corinne, the frustration still lingered. As the week went on, Marcus noticed something strange. His neighbors, who usually kept to themselves, had started acting a little differently toward him. They weren't rude or overtly hostile, but there was a noticeable shift in their behavior. It was subtle, but Marcus could feel it. He would wave to them as he passed by, and while most of them would wave back, their smiles seemed a little forced. The young couple with the kids had always been friendly, but now they seemed to look at him with a certain hesitance, like they weren't sure whether to talk to him or not. Even the older couple who lived across the street, whom Marcus had always chatted with during his early morning walks, now kept their distance. It didn't take long for Marcus to realize what was happening. Word had gotten out about the confrontation with Corinne. The neighborhood gossip had started, as it always did. It wasn't surprising. People loved to talk, especially when something unusual happened. And even though he had done nothing wrong, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the gossip was painting him as the troublemaker. He wasn't sure how the story had gotten around, but it was clear that Corinne had already shared her version of events with the neighbors. And from the looks of it, they weren't taking his side. One evening, Marcus decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear his head. As he strolled past a few of the houses, he caught snippets of conversations from his neighbors. Most of it was casual chatter about work or the weather, but there was an undercurrent of something more. He overheard one neighbor, a woman who lived a few doors down, talking to another woman about the situation with Corinne. "I heard Marcus is being really difficult about that pool," she said, her voice low but still loud enough for Marcus to hear. Apparently, he told Corinne she couldn't use it anymore, like it's his personal space or something. The other woman laughed, but there was a tinge of discomfort in her tone. "Well, I guess we all have our boundaries," she said. "But still, it seems a bit much, don't you think?" Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as he continued walking. He didn't want to eavesdrop, but the conversation stung. It was as if he was being painted as the villain in a story where he had only been trying to protect his own peace. The gossip wasn't just frustrating, it was painful. He had never wanted to cause trouble or create tension in his neighborhood. He had always been a quiet, respectful person. But now it seemed like he had become the subject of judgment, and no matter what he did, he couldn't escape it. That night, Marcus sat in his living room, staring at the walls. His mind raced with thoughts of what had been said about him, the way his neighbors were reacting, and what he could do about it. He knew that Corinne's version of the story was likely skewed. She had a way of making herself the victim in any situation, and now it seemed like she had turned the whole neighborhood against him. But Marcus wasn't sure how to fix it. He didn't want to confront Corinne again, especially not with the neighbors watching. He didn't want to escalate things further, but at the same time, he couldn't just let the gossip continue unchecked. For the next few days, Marcus decided to keep to himself even more than usual. He didn't want to deal with any more uncomfortable conversations or awkward glances from his neighbors. He kept his head down, went to work, and spent his evenings at home, avoiding the backyard as much as possible. The pool, once a source of relaxation, now felt like a symbol of the problem he couldn't solve. He tried to focus on his work and other hobbies, but the weight of the situation lingered. One Saturday morning, Marcus woke up early, determined to do something different. He had spent enough time brooding, and he knew he couldn't let the gossip consume him any longer. It was time to take action, but this time, he was going to approach the situation differently. He decided to invite a few of his neighbors over for a casual barbecue, something simple. He wasn't looking to make a statement or force anyone to choose sides. He just wanted to show them that he wasn't the troublemaker they might have thought. He wanted to rebuild the connections that had been strained. As he prepared the grill and set up the backyard, Marcus couldn't help but feel nervous. What if the invitation was rejected? What if no one came? But he pushed those thoughts aside. He had done nothing wrong, and he had a right to enjoy his space just as much as anyone else. He wasn't going to let a little gossip ruin his relationships with the people around him. By the time the afternoon rolled around, Marcus had set up a small outdoor table with food and drinks. He'd even added a few extra chairs, just in case. When the first knock came on his door, Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He opened the door to find his neighbor, the one who had been talking about him the other day, standing there with a nervous smile. "Hey, Marcus," she said, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I hope it's okay, but I brought my husband. We wanted to come by and, well, apologize. I think there's been some misunderstanding, and we wanted to clear the air." Marcus smiled, relief washing over him. "Of course," he said, stepping aside to let them in. "I'm glad you could make it." As the afternoon went on, more neighbors trickled in. The air was filled with casual chatter and the smell of grilled food. The awkwardness that had been present only days ago seemed to melt away, and Marcus realized that maybe, just maybe, the tension wasn't as thick as he had thought. The more people he spoke to, the more he understood that the situation hadn't been as black and white as it seemed. Some of the neighbors admitted that they hadn't gotten the full story, and they appreciated Marcus's honesty in inviting them over. By the end of the day, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in weeks. The gossip hadn't disappeared, but it seemed to have lost its power. He wasn't the villain anymore. He was just Marcus, the neighbor who had stood up for himself. And while things wouldn't go back to how they were before, he felt hopeful that they could find a new normal. The week after the barbecue, Marcus felt a small sense of relief. The event had been more successful than he could have hoped. The atmosphere had been relaxed, casual, and surprisingly warm. As he looked around his yard at his neighbors chatting and enjoying the food, it was clear that the tension that had once hung so heavily between them was starting to lift. People had come with their own hesitations, but by the end of the evening, many of them had apologized, admitted they didn't know the full story, and reassured Marcus that they valued him as a neighbor. There had been a few awkward moments, of course. Some of the conversations had felt a little forced at first, but as the afternoon wore on, the walls came down. The small talk turned into deeper discussions, and before long, Marcus felt like he had reconnected with the people around him in a way that hadn't seemed possible just a week before. It was as though the air had been cleared, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was back in control of his own neighborhood. Still, Marcus knew that things wouldn't just go back to the way they were before Karen started using his pool. There was no magic fix that could undo the events of the past few weeks, but at least now he could breathe a little easier. The whispers had stopped, and the cold stares had disappeared. Instead, there was a new sense of understanding, one where everyone could move forward without lingering bitterness. However, Marcus knew that this wasn't the end of the story. There would be challenges ahead, and he couldn't be naive enough to believe that everything had been fixed with a single conversation. There would still be moments of discomfort, small misunderstandings, and possibly even a few awkward encounters. But he had learned something important through all of this. Standing up for himself was not only possible, but necessary. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is take control of the narrative instead of letting others define it for you. It wasn't long before Marcus realized that there was more to this situation than just the pool. He began to see how much of his life had been shaped by his reluctance to speak up. For years, he had allowed situations like this to slide, hoping that things would work themselves out. He had kept his head down and tried to avoid conflict, not because he was a coward, but because he had convinced himself that avoiding confrontation was the right thing to do. It was easier to go along with things, to let others take advantage, than to rock the boat. But now, after everything that had happened, Marcus was beginning to understand that standing up for yourself was not an act of aggression. It was an act of self-respect. By speaking up, he had not only protected his space, but also set a precedent for how he would be treated going forward. No one else was going to set those boundaries for him. If he didn't take control of his own life, no one else would. One evening, as Marcus sat in his backyard enjoying the calm of his garden, he found himself reflecting on the entire experience. He had come to appreciate how much he had grown in such a short time. When Karen had first started using his pool, he had felt like an outsider in his own home, as though he had no right to defend his space. But after standing up for himself, he realized that he was not only protecting his property, but also his sense of self-worth. As the days passed, Marcus noticed a shift in himself. He became more confident, more willing to speak up when something didn't feel right. He started to engage more with his neighbors, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to connect. He found himself smiling at them when they passed by, waving without the sense of unease that had once accompanied these simple gestures. His interactions with them felt more authentic, grounded in mutual respect. The sense of peace he had longed for was slowly returning, but it wasn't the same peace he had before. This time, it was a deeper, more grounded kind of tranquility, one that came from knowing he had stood up for himself and had done the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. Marcus also began to understand how much of his previous frustration had come from a lack of communication. Karen's behavior, which had felt so intrusive and disrespectful at first, had been a result of his own silence. He had assumed that people would naturally understand and respect his boundaries without him having to say anything. But the truth was that people don't always pick up on unspoken cues. If you don't make your needs clear, they can easily be overlooked or ignored. This realization didn't just apply to Karen, it extended to other areas of his life as well. Marcus had always been the kind of person who preferred to keep his problems to himself, thinking that it was better not to burden others. But now he saw that communication was key to building meaningful relationships, whether with friends, family, or neighbors. If you didn't make your boundaries clear, people could easily take advantage, and that would only lead to resentment. The next week, Marcus received a visit from another neighbor. This time, it was the elderly woman who lived across the street. She had always been friendly, though they hadn't spoken much beyond the occasional greeting. When she knocked on his door, Marcus was a little surprised, but he welcomed her inside with a smile. "I just wanted to stop by and say thank you," she said as she sat down in his living room. "I heard about what happened with Karen, and I wanted to tell you that I really respect what you did. It's not easy to stand up for yourself, especially in a situation like that." Marcus felt a little embarrassed by the compliment but was grateful for her kind words. "Thank you," he said, still unsure of what to say. "It wasn't easy, but I had to do something. I wasn't going to let it go on any longer." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. Sometimes it's hard to know when to speak up, especially when you're trying to avoid conflict. But I've seen too many people let things go on for too long, and it never ends well. I'm glad you did what you did." Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of warmth from her words. "I appreciate that. It's not something I usually do, but I'm glad I did." As she left, Marcus felt a small but significant shift inside of him. It was one thing to know he had done the right thing, but hearing it from someone else, someone who had witnessed the situation from the outside, reinforced his decision and made him feel even more confident in his actions. The days that followed were a mix of continued peace and small, unexpected moments of connection. Marcus had begun to see his neighbors in a new light. They were people with their own struggles, their own challenges, and most of them weren't as perfect as they appeared. He started to let go of his resentment and judgment, realizing that they were all just trying to live their lives the best way they knew how. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus's life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. His backyard remained his sanctuary, a place where he could relax and recharge. He no longer worried about Karen showing up uninvited. He had set the boundary, and it had been respected. And while the memory of the conflict still lingered in the back of his mind, Marcus no longer felt burdened by it. He had learned that it was okay to stand up for himself, that his needs and boundaries mattered just as much as anyone else's. Most importantly, he had learned that it was never too late to change, to find his voice, and to take control of his life. Weeks passed, and as time moved forward, Marcus found himself slipping into a routine that, while not without its challenges, felt more comfortable than he had imagined it would. His interactions with his neighbors, once strained and filled with quiet tension, had begun to settle into a more natural rhythm. The awkwardness that had been so present for so long had softened into something more casual, and dare he say, friendly. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments where the past seemed to hang in the air, but Marcus had grown accustomed to the idea that life didn't always have to be smooth. What mattered was the ability to move forward, to learn from mistakes, and to create something better. From the pieces left behind. The first time Marcus felt the shift in his life truly take hold was on a Saturday afternoon, when he was sitting on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee. It had become one of his favorite things to do. Just sit in his favorite chair, with the sun shining and the birds chirping, and take a few minutes to breathe. His mind often wandered to the past, to the time before he had spoken up, when he had felt like he was drifting through life without direction. The Marcus who had let people walk all over him, the man who avoided confrontation at all costs, seemed so distant now. He was proud of the man he had become, even if that man was still learning, still growing. That afternoon, as he sat with his coffee, he noticed something that made him smile. A couple of his neighbors, people who had once kept their distance, were walking by, and instead of merely nodding in passing, they stopped to chat. At first, Marcus had hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk to them. It was just that the old habits of avoiding anything uncomfortable lingered. But now, with a slight feeling of pride, he stood and walked over to them. "Hey, how's it going?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his heart was beating a little faster than usual. To his surprise, both of the neighbors smiled brightly at him and welcomed the opportunity to catch up. The conversation started slowly, but soon it was easy, like slipping into a comfortable pair of shoes. They talked about work, about the changes in the neighborhood, and about how they had all been trying to adjust to the quieter pace of life lately. There was no judgment, no lingering tension, just two people who had a conversation about life, the same as any other day. Later, when the conversation came to a natural end, Marcus found himself feeling lighter, more at ease with the world around him. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but it occurred to him as he sat back down on the porch. This was what peace felt like. It wasn't just about avoiding the issues or hoping they would go away. It was about facing them, speaking up when it mattered, and learning how to coexist in a way that respected both himself and others. Even after the barbecue, when the tension had settled down, Marcus continued to work on strengthening his relationships with those around him. He made a conscious effort to engage more, to be present, and to reach out. When he saw Karen walking her dog in the neighborhood, he no longer avoided her or looked the other way. He gave her a simple nod, nothing more, but it was enough. It was a quiet acknowledgement that things had changed, that they had both learned something valuable. One day, Marcus decided to take a long walk around the neighborhood. It had been a while since he'd taken the time to just wander and think. As he walked through the streets, passing by familiar houses and streets, he couldn't help but reflect on the changes that had taken place in his life. The weight he had once carried, the constant unease about his space, had all been replaced with a new sense of clarity. He passed by Karen's house, and for the first time since all of this started, he didn't feel the anger bubbling up inside of him. He didn't even feel resentment. Instead, he simply felt neutral. She had her space and he had his. That was it. There was no need to dwell on the past anymore. He had done what he needed to do, and now the only thing that mattered was moving forward. As he walked, he realized that the biggest change wasn't in his neighbor's behavior or his interactions with them, but in himself. He had grown stronger, more self-assured. He had learned that it was okay to have boundaries, that his voice mattered just as much as anyone else's. It wasn't about being confrontational or trying to be right. It was about respecting himself enough to stand up for what he needed and finding the strength to do so without feeling guilty. By the time Marcus returned home, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the sky. He stood at the entrance to his yard, taking in the view, and felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. It wasn't just the tranquility of the evening or the beauty of the setting sun. It was the feeling of having earned this peace, of knowing that he had fought for it and had come out the other side stronger than before. Marcus's backyard, once a symbol of his frustrations, was now a place of refuge, a reminder that peace wasn't something that was handed to you. It was something you created through your actions and choices. He could sit by his pool now without the weight of resentment pressing on him, without the feeling that something was being stolen from him. The pool was his space again, but it wasn't just about the pool. It was about all of it: his life, his relationships, and his ability to protect the things that mattered most to him. The next morning, as Marcus sat on his porch with his coffee, he saw a familiar face approaching from down the street. It was Karen. This time, she wasn't walking her dog or heading out to the pool. She was simply walking, as if enjoying the morning. She looked over and caught his eye, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in her gaze, maybe recognition, maybe something more, but it was brief. She smiled and waved, and without hesitation, Marcus waved back. It wasn't a moment of reconciliation or some deep conversation. It was simply a wave between two people who had learned how to coexist in a way that felt respectful and genuine. The past wasn't forgotten, but it had been acknowledged and put to rest. The lessons had been learned, and the peace that Marcus had fought for was his to keep. And so, life in the neighborhood continued. It wasn't perfect, but nothing ever was. The days flowed by, each one bringing with it its own challenges, small victories, and quiet moments of reflection. Marcus was no longer the man who let others take from him without asking. He was someone who understood that the strength to stand up for yourself wasn't about fighting or winning. It was about finding the courage to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy. In the end, Marcus realized that the true victory wasn't just in the conversations he had with others, but in the peace he had found within himself. And as he sat in his backyard, watching the sunset, he knew that he was ready for whatever came next, because he had learned the most important lesson of all. His space was his own, and he had the power to protect it in every sense of the word.